Raj, welcome to the India at Harvard podcast. As fellow students from the Harvard Kennedy School, we are delighted to have you here today. You are a DC based journalist, you're a social impact leader, you are the author of The Business of Changing the World, a book that you have written about the future of global aid and global philanthropy. You are also president and editor-in-chief of Devex, an independent news organization that you founded almost 25 years ago, an extraordinary amount of time to witness so many new patterns and changes and market forces coming into the aid and philanthropy sector. So we are really delighted to have you here today. Thanks for taking the time out.
Oh, I'm thrilled to be here, Priyanka and Ani. It's a real pleasure. And you mentioned the Kennedy School. It had a huge part in the creation of this whole career for me, and in the creation of Devex. So I feel really close to the Kennedy School and really thankful for my experience there at Harvard. And so it's great to be a part of this conversation for that reason too.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Thanks.
So, Raj, we thought we would start out on a personal note, which we always do, given that this podcast is an audience that is affiliated to Harvard. So tell us about your time at the Kennedy School and the early rumblings of Devex. What made you start Devex? What was the need at that time? What did you observe?
So you said we're about to celebrate our 25th anniversary next year, in fact. So this was 1999. I mean, it really dates me. It's back in a different century. But in 1999, I was a student at the Kennedy School. I had gone there because I had been working mostly in politics ever since I left undergrad. And even when I was still in undergrad, I was working for President Clinton doing advance work in the 96 presidential race. And I was really into this world of political consulting and campaigning. And it was really exciting and vibrant, but I sort of felt I was getting away from my original personal calling. I'd spent part of my young life in India as a kid. I was born and raised in New Jersey, but I had a lot of relatives in India, as probably many others listening to this have gone through a similar experience. And so, I would go, my family would take me back every year, every other year. I would spend a couple of months. And I got really into the issues around global development from that experience. I remember being a little kid playing soccer, and the soccer wasn't really a field, but it was sort of a gravel pit near my aunt's home. And I was the only kid who had sneakers on, and so that's the kind of thing that hits you. And then I was just fortunate. I had an aunt and an uncle who were development scholars, from Gujarat. They had spent their career studying the dairy cooperative movement in India. And so they're really prominent in their field and spending a lot of time in villages. And they would take me on some of these visits. And so even as a young kid, I sort of had an idea of what is global development, or at least some feel for these issues. And so I really wanted to work in that, but I ended up working in politics. And so at some point I was feeling a bit disillusioned with my career choices. And I thought, I've got to make a shift. And the Kennedy School was part of that desire to make a shift. So I applied there. I went there to study international development, to try to get a career in this field. And I remember going to the Career Center and asking them, how do I find a list of jobs in global development? So I'm here to study. I want to go work in this field, new field for me. And they sort of said, well, it doesn't really work that way. You have to know people. You've got to go to Washington. You've got to attend cocktail parties. I thought, this is crazy. This is a mission-driven sector trying to address global poverty and so many other related issues, and yet it's kind of an insider club. And so I started kind of noodling with some close friends on ideas for how to address that challenge. And long story short, and I'll tell you more about it in a moment, but I just ultimately said, hey, maybe there's an online platform here that needs to be built that would list all the jobs I wanted to see as a student, that would have all the NGOs and organizations working in this field, that would show me projects. If I wanted to see who's working on global health in Peru, I could just look it up and see that. And then also that would give me some news about what's happening. And I was really shocked to find there was no newspaper, there was no magazine, there was no independent media covering what, at least to me, seemed like some of the most important issues in the world. So that was the germ of the idea in 1999. and 2000. And it just so happened, you remember, I mentioned the year in part because you remember that era was the internet boom.
Yeah, I was going to say, there's the .com and then the bust that follows a year or two later.
So we were a bit caught up in that, in the sense that I had co-founded with some friends from my undergraduate from Georgetown, a financial media company. And we were basically writing about stocks, and we were trying to give advice about which stocks to buy or not buy in newsletters. And we ended up building the 10th largest financial newsletter in America, email newsletter. And we did this in like 18 months during the middle of that .com boom. And when I was a student at the Kennedy School, I remember this well because I don't know if you experienced this, Priyanka, but I just remember going to my first Kennedy School gathering, and the associate dean was there. And he sort of casually joked about how we're not allowed to have a job while we're a student. And I didn't know this. So I had a job.
Lots of new information here in this conversation already.
Right? And so I remember going to class with my rolly bag, because I had to take the flight to New York to meet people. I had, we were working on this business, and I didn't realize. So I was kind of secretly working part-time while attending the Kennedy School. And we ended up selling that company. And that partly also gave me this idea that maybe if we could do something similar, kind of a media lens, newsletters and the website, but for the space I actually cared about, because I didn't care that much about the financial media space. Maybe there was a chance there. So that's sort of, how this all ended up coming together.
No, that's lovely. And now it's been 25 years. As you're saying, you're coming up on your 25th anniversary. So congratulations in advance for that. Tell us about how the world has changed in this particular subworld of development aid that you've inhabited now and led in many ways over the last 25 years. What's changed? How have the players changed? How has the market or the dynamics of aid changed? Give us like a big picture view, and then maybe we'll dig into some of the specifics.
Sure. Yeah, I love that. I guess it's changed a lot. And I should say part of the change we anticipated, but we were really wrong about the timing. So, I mentioned the .com boom.
Yep.
So when we started Devex, we thought, well, every industry is being transformed by technology and by the internet, and global development will be no different. It's going to be fundamentally transformed, right? And we were just completely wrong. Because, in the end, the development sector, while it looked kind of very diverse, actually all those acronyms, all those UN agencies, all those NGOs, ultimately they were funded by basically 5 governments. And, almost half of that was just coming from the US. So, essentially it was very dominated by public sector funding.
Which were these 5 at the time, other than the US? I'm curious. So UK?
Well, I guess Japan, Germany, the UK, and France were the big ones. And they still remain, obviously, since then, China has become a huge funder, maybe on par. It's hard to tell exactly, but depending how you measure it, maybe on par with the US or slightly less. But at the time, it was really just those 5. And what happened, I think, because of that, was it was a somewhat insulated industry from the technology trends and the disruption that was happening in every other industry. And so things really didn't shift in global development in the ways we were expecting, right? We thought there was going to be all this new innovation, all these new ideas. I remember, going, I guess it's probably 2010 or so, going to a science event at MIT. It was kind of like a science fair for these amazing engineering students. And they had been working on new tech for low-income countries.
Yes.
So, amazing, a bicycle that you could use to generate power and all kinds of things, right?
Yeah.
And it was really cool. It was really whiz-bang. These were brilliant kids, but you could just tell none of these things had any chance because the industry we were in was so bureaucratic. There was nobody to go out there and buy this. Nobody would be allowed to. The industry was so risk-averse. There was no dollars for just taking a bet or a risk on some kid and their new invention, right?
Yeah.
As there would be in so many other industries.
Spaces.
So I think we got that really wrong. And it took, another 10, maybe 20 years before some big shifts started to happen in the development space that actually did lead to the real changes that we're seeing now. I think global development is being disrupted right now It's a lot about what I write about in my book. So when you ask like big picture, what's shifted? Well, essentially we had like 20 years in which the basic model of global development, which was largely government led, didn't really change, but it grew a lot. You had this this unlikely coalition on the right and the left of the political spectrum in the US and in Europe supporting more and more aid. And so you saw total aid sort of triple globally. The US, I remember that 1997, I think was the lowest point for US foreign assistance. It was under 7 billion. And now, depending on how you look at it, it's 40 or 50 billion a year. So it's really dramatically grown. And those 2 decades were big. A lot of it happened during George W. Bush's administration. He was a Republican. He was seen as not someone who would support foreign aid, but he ended up being its biggest supporter. And he created a number of new institutions and initiatives around foreign aid. So we had this huge explosion in aid. But the model of delivering aid was still largely projects. It was still largely somebody sitting in a conference room in London or in New York or in DC would say, okay, I look out across the world, to Africa or to India even, and say, hey, I think I understand the problem. I can identify this problem, this reason people are hungry. And I think I can identify the solution too, sitting in my air-conditioned conference room on the other side of the world. And now all I need to do is to hire an NGO or a company to go implement my idea.
Yeah.
It was still largely the way our system was structured. I mean, I'm generalizing, of course, but there was a lot of that. And often that solution involved flying in Americans or Europeans to far-flung places to go and tell the locals, how it works and how to do it. So I think now things are really shifting. We're in a moment where public money is actually maybe a minority of total funding, that private funding from philanthropy and from private sector and impact investors has grown so much that it's very tough to actually measure it, but it's getting to that scale where they are comparable. And that's a huge shift. So right away, you have some real competition, even just competition for ideas about like, what's the right way to do this work? And then I think people who've been in this field for a long time have realized, hey, this is a kind of, we've kind of been stuck in our models. And a lot of it's because we're very risk averse, because it's government money, it's taxpayer money. And so that's starting to shift. There's been a lot more innovation, a lot of new ideas, new models coming, many of them funded by places like the Gates Foundation, as an example, another Harvard connection, as you know. And so I think we're seeing like a moment when there's a competition for ideas. There's no longer kind of a monopsony or oligopsony in terms of who's funding. Now there's like, if you have a great idea and you're a grad student at MIT or Harvard or wherever, or more likely you're in a local community somewhere, you actually can go and seek funding from so many different funders. You can go online and find hundreds of different foundations and even individuals. It's just a very different space than it was 20, 25 years ago. So I think big picture, just to kind of, get going on your question, it's like we were in this very government funded, very small, closed world, and it's really exploded and opened up.
Yeah, which is exciting. I know Priyanka has another question, but I wanted to ask you. So you mentioned obviously the 5 governments on the government side that were largely dominating when it was government driven. In today's world, you obviously mentioned there are hundreds of private funders now out there, but if you were to look at that piece of the funding pie chart, is that equally concentrated though? Are there like many of the big ones that are the, let's say 70-80% of the private funding is coming for 4 or 5 foundations, or is it really widely spread out?
Yeah, it's similarly concentrated, but less so. And it's becoming less and less concentrated because there's so much private wealth, both in the billionaire class and in just ultra high net worth, and even ordinary citizens in middle income or high income countries who are philanthropic and now have easier ways to give. There's many easy ways to give with your cell phone, $10 a month, to a charity. It's become very frictionless in a way. So there's a really long tail. So even though it's right to focus on a group like the Gates Foundation, which is $8.6 billion in funding this year, making it, arguably it's the size of government, certainly. It's arguably as big as the British government, which is around the 3rd largest donor this year. especially when you strip out from government funding a lot of things that you and I might not really consider aid, but are technically counted as aid. For example, right now, about a quarter to a third of British aid goes for hotel bills for refugees inside the UK. So it's not what we would normally think of, right, when you're imagining humanitarian efforts or development efforts in a different country, right? Yeah. So there's a lot of that going on. So yes, to answer your question, it is concentrated, but it's increasingly less and less so. There's more and more funding coming. And at the same time, the government side has also become less concentrated. There are more big donors, including the Gulf countries, India, Korea, China by far, is like sort of the gates of that picture. But there's a longer tail coming in the philanthropic side, a much longer tail, and I think that's as well part of the shakeup, because you can be relatively small, but if you are willing to take risk, you can actually have a huge impact by funding startups, new ideas, individual leadership programs. There's a lot you can do with relatively small amounts of money when you don't have the constraints of government financing.
Yeah.
Raj, one would have thought that over the last 25 years, eradicating extreme poverty, right? We perhaps would have moved to a time where aid decreases, right? Hopefully we tackle these challenges that we've been seeing from 25 years ago, from AIDS to malaria to polio. But you're saying that the pot of money grew, right? Almost tripled. So do you think the era of big aid is coming to an end anytime soon? How do you kind of observe the perhaps the decentralization or the decrease of size in institutions such as DFID or USAID? I guess to that world of saying, where do you think 25 years from now we're going to see? Are you going to still see an increase in funding? Do you see a decrease? What are the patterns that you would expect now, 25 years from now?
I think there's going to be an enormous increase in funding. And this is a little counterintuitive, because at the moment, it feels like that's not at all going to happen. In fact, we're facing immediate decreases. But you asked about, ending extreme poverty as an example, right? I think if you just look out ahead 10, 20, 30 years, the challenges are going to get much bigger. It's not as though, we've spent all this money, we've built this global aid infrastructure, and things are getting so much better. They're on a sustainable path to growth. It's actually not the case. There's pockets where there are real success stories of countries that have become sustainable growers on their own, and they're eliminating poverty themselves. But you see a lot of countries that are stuck, and it's very hard to see a positive trajectory for them. And the climate crisis is getting worse. Conflicts are growing. There's more migration that's affecting politics in the global north. So when I look out in the longer run, I just think the needs are going to be so dramatic that there will have to be more money for it. It may be a different kind of money. It might come from different sources. It might be much more philanthropic or more private sector. There's a big reform underway around the multilateral development banks designed to try to crowd in, as they say, trillions in private money into the space. So it might look very different than the way this field has looked before, but the needs are so big. I can't imagine we end up in a place where the world simply abandons most countries, because obviously there's going to be direct implications everywhere. It's a small planet, and there will be implications everywhere, as there already are on the political stability and the political nature of global north countries. So
right.
I think long run, this is not ending. And part of it comes down to kind of what is our view of why people are poor? Like that, one of the things when you write a book like the one I wrote, you have to ask yourself some of these very fundamental questions that you think, I know the answer to this. I've been, talking about this forever, but you're sort of forced when you put it on paper to think about it a bit. And so if you think about it kind of hard about, well, why is it people are actually poor? At least where I come down is it's not a simple problem of resources. It's not as though like you can just write a check. And if you write a big enough check, you end global poverty. And I think Bill Gates has a line along these lines. Like if you go up to someone who is living in extreme poverty and you fold $100 bill and put it in their pocket and you walk away, are they now no longer extremely poor? He says something like that. And it's an interesting thought experiment because chances are the reason someone is really at the bottom of the pyramid globally is that they are facing some kind of injustice. It's not just like that they've had some hard luck. That might be part of it, but probably they're facing some real discrimination. Maybe it's a woman who lives in a country, India is still one of these, where there's a lot of, young girls married off at a young age. And my grandmother was married at 13. So, you think about a girl who's married at 13, how does that affect her life? Yes, maybe later on you can give her a lot of money and say, let's pull her out of poverty and stuff. But chances are a lot of things have happened that have made it really hard for her to ever get out of that situation. And then what happens to her kids and their kids? And so I think if you think about this from a justice perspective or a rights perspective, and you think of all the discrimination and injustice that exists in the world that leads to things like conflict, it makes the idea of poverty like something more real and something harder to solve with just money.
Yeah.
And so I think with that perspective, like we're not getting out of this, by 2030, which is the SDG. These are problems that have been with us a really long time, and they're not going to go away. So you look even at the United States, richest country in the world by many measures, superpower. There was never a superpower like the US in the history of the world. And yet we still need a gigantic domestic philanthropic and NGO community, even here.
Yeah.
Right. So I don't see how we get out of a situation where that's needed globally. Hopefully in places like India is a good example, you end up with more of a domestic philanthropic and NGO community in countries, rather than it coming from overseas. Maybe it's just supported more from overseas. But I think the long run trajectory is the needs will remain great. And so the funding will remain great, but it may shift a lot in terms of who's funding it. It might be more domestic government money, domestic philanthropic money. It might be multilateral development banks, de-risking projects so that, international banks and private equity can invest in projects. And it may look really different than sort of charity, but I think the amounts and the needs will just both continue to grow.
Yeah. So to dig deeper now, so we've talked about how the who is changing, right? Whose funding is clearly going through massive shifts from the government to more private and so on and so forth. Talk to us about on what, right? So how are the focus areas also now expected to change, and how are they already maybe changing? You mentioned climate and migration, obviously, as two issues that you're seeing more maybe efforts that need to go into that. But talk to us about, the other day when Priyanka and I were talking about, having this conversation with you, one of the things we were discussing is that maybe 20 years ago, having not been in the field, my impression was that education and healthcare seemed to be the two main focus areas that a lot of aid used to go towards, right? How do you expect that to change? Like, are the focus areas going to change substantially? And if so, what are some of those focus areas that you're expecting to gain more and more of the dollars that are getting directed into aid?
I think climate is the one that's like obvious because that one's truly newer and it's continuing a trajectory. So, and it affects everything else, right? Especially health as a good example where, you now see malaria in Europe, right? Like, mosquitoes move based on climate changes, rainfall. So you're going to see infectious diseases shifting their patterns. You're going to see new pathogens created by, thawing of the permafrost and things like that. So I think you'll end up with, and obviously humans, more interfacing with nature is leading to new, zoonotic diseases that jump to humans. So I think health is going to be shifted a lot by climate. And climate affects everything else too. It affects, transportation,
livelihoods,
roads, you name it, right? Like every issue sort of gets affected. So that's probably the biggest major macro shift in topic. Everything else is sort of what's old is new again. There's always like a cyclical thing where I always meet people who are coming with a brand new idea around a brand new issue, and you find out, well, they were working on that 30 years ago somewhere else in global development. So I don't know that anything else is all that new.
But Raj, do you feel that from 25 years ago when you left the Kennedy School and started Devex, were you covering stories around technology or innovation? Are you seeing I mean, just in the last 5 years, we've seen a proliferation of conversation on blockchain and so many different technologies, digital public infrastructure coming through. India is doing a huge agenda now on digital public goods to bring to Africa. Do you feel that that was there 25 years ago, or were you seeing on a smaller scale projects and news around small scale innovation then as well?
No, you're absolutely right. That is a new thing too. I think of it somewhat as like enabling these other areas.
Mm,
Um, but it is also kind of its own vertical, like the World Bank is funding specifically areas in digital public infrastructure, as you say, and Gates and many others are doing it.
Yeah.
And you're right, India is a big leader on it because of Aadhaar and so many success
mhm,
stories within the country. Um, so you're right. I think that should count as its own new topic area. It's big enough, even though it's kind of a bit like climate, it's cross-cutting and touching everything. There is a lot of investment in that area too.
mm,
And, it is somewhat connected too to the moment we're living in where we are now, I guess maybe we're in sort of like a new Cold War between the West and China and Russia,
Yeah.
perhaps. And, that's leading to a lot of thinking about like, how does globalization look different now? A lot of this onshoring and nearshoring, which is a major topic in development too. Like I know India is doing a lot to develop a domestic chips industry. And, it's doing that in part because of the risk of Taiwan in the middle of this geopolitical conflict and, the West wanting more places to be able to rely on. And so, chips aren't something you necessarily think of as a development topic, but we just had a big story on it, I guess, a week or two ago now, because it turns out building chip factories requires enormous amounts of water.
mm.
And India is living under pretty severe, water
Water.
constraints and water scarcity. So these things end up being really connected. And that's sort of the case in almost any issue. If you look at any low or middle income country, almost every story is a development story. So it's interesting. You asked Priyanka, like, what were we covering when we started versus now? I feel like when we started, a lot of the topics we were covering felt really narrow and siloed. And now almost everything we write about could be on the front page of the New York Times too,
Mhm,
because everything is so connected.
mhm.
Um, and so that's a big shift maybe in the way people see this space of global development, that it's something everyone should see themselves in. Whereas 25 years ago, if you talk to somebody who was in this field, they would say, well, I work at UNICEF and I do education. And now I think more and more, at least just talking to friends and colleagues and even alums from my time at the Kennedy School, everyone is touching this space in some way. You can work
Yeah.
at a giant corporation at Starbucks. Your coffee, when you go to Starbucks in the morning, anywhere in the world pretty much, you'll see like coffee of the day. And it's probably from a country where like 50% of the population lives in extreme poverty. It's from Ethiopia or Rwanda or Honduras or Guatemala. Like, so if you're working at Starbucks, you're in global development. You need to make sure that coffee supply is coming to you. It's good quality. There's sustainable water.
Yeah.
There's no child labor, right? Like you're in development. So yeah. So I think that, there's some new topics. A lot of the underlying topics are the same,
Same, yep.
but the biggest thing is it's just now, this is a topic that's relevant to everybody.
You've touched upon geopolitics, right, very briefly, and that's something that I look at a lot, Raj. So I've got to ask you this: how much is these geopolitical rumblings that you were talking about, right, where Russia, China, and maybe US and friends are going to turn more and more into maybe even blocks? How much of that do you think is going to drive and shape the nature of aid now? Because obviously, both sides seem to be very clear that we want to make sure that the rest of the world doesn't go too away from us. So, is your sense that the nature of aid and maybe the role of governments again might gain prominence given these geopolitical developments in our world?
I think so. And I think it's already happening in a big way. I think if you look back, there was most of the period of the development of a global aid industry happened during the Cold War.
Yeah.
And it was really shaped by the Cold War. So, we picked countries that were our ally, and they were partly our ally because we were funding them and we wanted to fund them more than the Soviet Union would. So, I think in a lot of ways, the Cold War was really good for the amount of foreign aid. It really drove more and more foreign aid, but it was pretty bad for aid effectiveness.
Yes.
We ended up funding kleptocratic regimes and dictators, and sometimes I don't think it mattered in some ways whether the aid actually worked, because we were just trying to buy support,
Make sure that
political
the
support.
leaders were aligned to you, but not necessarily that the aid was
That's right.
achieving the objectives it was meant for. Yeah.
And then we got out of that, and we had this sort of golden era of a couple of decades where geopolitics wasn't really driving. I mean, it was always there, but it wasn't the fundamental driver of foreign aid. There was really this view of long-term development, of opening markets and global growth, and that led to all this funding and this huge increase in total foreign assistance. And now, it's around $200 billion a year, which is like what the world spends on iPhones, is what we spend on foreign aid now. And so it's become this big thing. But now we're slipping back into a geopolitical lens on everything. And, if you go to Capitol Hill, it's entirely polarized, right? The U.S. political conversation is totally polarized, except for an anti-China argument. That really unites both parties.
Yeah.
And so that's the argument being used for almost every foreign assistance, bill, funding, appropriation right now. It's all about that. It's, hey, if we don't fund this, China will be there. So I think that's the case in the US. It's the same thing in Europe, right? It's very similar. And so I think it's already driving the approach. And the question is it going to lead to really poor development outcomes?
That was
Is it
going to
going
be
to
my next
drive it so
question.
far
Yeah,
that,
it seems.
you end up with, and I don't know, it's a really big question, right? Because a lot of it connects to technology, where it's hard to think of a development intervention nowadays, kind of to Priyanka's earlier point, that doesn't involve using the internet, using mobile telephony, using payments, and obviously the world is starting to split into two different technology ecosystems between the West and China. And so if the U.S. funds a program, are we going to make sure there's no Huawei phones used?
Most
they're
likely.
pretty ubiquitous in a lot of the countries that we're talking about, right? So suddenly I think you could end up in a very strange, inefficient situation, because we're trying to fund two separate technology ecosystems to drive development outcomes. So it's not clear to me how this will shake out, but I do think we're in a different moment. And I don't think this is a short-term trend. This feels like feels like the 20 years of that golden period, that was the blip. And now we're back to a longer-term trend of geopolitics driving at least the government side of this field.
Raj, I do want to bring in another powerful player on the block. I mean, those are your private corporations, right? In just the last few weeks, you've been at events at the White House with the World Bank Group, at Harvard, at the I think the summit with the MasterCard Foundation as well. So tell us about how corporations now are being viewed by all of these stakeholders from government. How is government viewing corporations and their contribution in philanthropy and aid, and how are corporations seeing their sense of responsibility as well?
Yeah, I think that summit you mentioned that the MasterCard, the company actually, not the foundation, puts on, and that's interesting to your point, because there is a huge MasterCard Foundation, but actually this is something the company does, and we support them on it as the media partner for it. It's the Global Inclusive Growth Summit, and there's lots of Fortune 500 CEOs and others that come to this. And I think it does show exactly what you're saying, which is the private sector role in global development has never been bigger. There's never been a more kind of open view on the part of the private sector that this is their space too, that they have to play a role here. And the Starbucks example is a good one, but there are many others where in the end, if you're running a major corporation, it's hard to divorce yourself from these issues because they affect your supply chains. Chances are, if you're in the food space, if you're, in any way related to agriculture, if you're in manufacturing, if you're in tech and you have tech consumers around the world, like chances are low and middle income countries are really important in either your supply chain, your value chain, or to your customers, so you kind of can't divorce yourself from what's happening there. And then when you look at those issues, you look at those countries, you have to say, all right, well, where are the levers? And whereas in like the United States or in Europe, the levers might mostly be domestic in those countries. If the U.S. is an important market, you go to Congress or you go to state governments. If a country in sub-Saharan Africa is important to you, chances are the levers are both inside that country, but they're also UN agencies, multilateral development banks, bilateral aid agencies, NGOs. So companies have to play in this development ecosystem if they want to be a positive actor in, let's say, cybersecurity or driving internet connectivity or sustainable agriculture or whatever the things are they need for their business. So I think the big shift is companies are more relevant than ever. They see themselves in this space, and they see themselves in it not just in a philanthropic way, not because they want to improve their brand reputation or whatever, which that's still there, but they increasingly see themselves in it because it's core to their business.
That's right.
And that's big because that's where the real money is and the real expertise is.
So they're clear that this is, integral to achieving their bottom line, right?
Not everyone, but many.
But many. Okay. And how are governments and multilaterals like the World Bank viewing corporations? Are they seeing them increasingly as an entity they want to partner with? How are they viewing, how are other entities viewing the contribution of corporations?
I think pretty much the skepticism that used to exist is mostly gone. So, 25 years ago when we started Devex, the kind of standard view inside the development community was one of great skepticism about corporations, profit-making initiatives. There was a sense of like, this is a mission-driven field, and these guys are out there trying to make money, and they don't really fit here. And I think that has largely been extinguished. It's not gone, but it's largely been extinguished because people see the relevance across almost any topic. Climate is a good one with renewable energy. There's going to be a massive private sector role in renewable energy. It's hard to envision a way you would get there without it. So that understanding is more and more understood. That doesn't mean there isn't still skepticism about profit motivation and desire to regulate or to ensure that companies kind of play the right role in this space. There still is that. And anytime government money is involved, there's a sense of like, hey, we got to be careful we're not picking winners or favorites.
That's right.
So a lot of that is still there. But fortunately, what I find is more and more private companies are at the table, and more there's an understanding that they have a key role to play. Now, actually getting past sort of one-off pilot projects, little like public-private partnerships that sort of sound good, and everyone signs an MOU, moving from that to like really scaled initiatives, that's a bigger challenge. And that's sort of the moment we're at now. You know that the World Bank has a new president in Ajay Banga, who was the CEO of Harvard. And that's really his remit, is to take that institution and really change its culture and its approach such that it can crowd in the private sector. And that means private sector investment, but it also means big corporations and domestic small and medium companies inside low and middle income countries to be part of a sustainable approach, not just a one-off project, not like a loan to build a road. Those are important, but that's not where the World Bank needs to go. It's more like what he's trying to do right now, which is electrify entire regions of the world and bring electricity to 100 million West Africans, that kind of thing. And that's going to take companies. That's going to take private investment. You can't just do that as the World Bank.
Yeah. No, and I think that's a fascinating piece to watch. You're absolutely right. It's a fundamental shift, even in the nature of institutions like the World Bank, but even, I guess, broadly the development world. So it's, I think, one real trend to watch. But let's come to India now. We've obviously, over the last half an hour or so, touched upon India briefly. How is India being perceived now in this world of development and aid? Obviously, last 25 years, much like a country like China, India has also been through a development transformation to some extent, still work in progress. But how has the perception of India changed in the development world that you work in? How is it being seen? How is it being covered on Devex? What are some of the changes you're seeing there?
I think there's like two big narratives in the development space when I talk to leaders and practitioners in this field. So one big narrative is, India is kind of that next opportunity to reach global goals. So China was the reason in many ways that the world saw poverty rates dramatically decline. When I was born, 1975, 4 in 10 people on Earth were living in extreme poverty, and now we're down to 1 in 10, or even a little less than 1 in 10. So that's a dramatic shift, in around 5 decades. So the thought is, hey, India could be the next one, the next leg in dramatic cuts in child mortality rates and in hunger rates and in poverty rates. India is on track to maybe do that, partly just given its scale, like a China. It's 1.4 billion people, partly given its rapid economic growth. And so if these trends can sustain, that there's a huge opportunity here to really see a big shift on the macro picture when it comes to global poverty. And so there's a lot of hopefulness around that. Similarly, people look at India as now a net foreign aid exporter.
Yeah.
It still takes some foreign assistance, but it's mostly in the form of multilateral development bank lending, much less in the form of philanthropic grants or direct aid, grant funding. And it's also now doing its own foreign aid. It has its own foreign policy, and it drives aid overseas as a result. So there's a look at India in some ways sort of like Korea, or maybe it's not quite there yet, but as a foreign aid success story. Look, a lot of aid was provided. Now India itself is giving out more aid than it's getting. So I think that's sort of the one side of the narrative, and it's a very positive narrative, and it leads to a lot of international organizations wanting to work in India and with India.
Yeah.
Then there's a more negative narrative, which is saying, hey, look, India is politically shifting, it's changing. And so that's actually potentially a threat both to democratic freedoms, human rights, civil rights in the country, and it's maybe a threat to its long-term development. And so you'll see those two threads even in our reporting at Devex and in other reporting you read. And that second one it kind of goes something like this: like, well, India is doing a lot in terms of social welfare. We had a recent story about this. I think something like 950 million Indians receive some kind of government subsidy. I remember being a kid going with my relatives to the ration stores, and you could buy fruits and vegetables and rice at a discount, and that was, it's not seen maybe as the most efficient way to do global development. There's a former Harvard professor, Lant Pritchett, who has talked a lot about critiques of cash transfers for this reason. Like, it might really help right now in this moment that individual person, but in the long run, you probably also help a lot of people who may not need it as much. A lot of middle class people end up taking those subsidies. And then, are you investing in long-term development, things like water infrastructure, things like roads, the healthcare system? So there's a bit of a debate that, like, we now have this more populist government that's playing on divisions in the country, that is becoming a little bit more authoritarian in nature, and that maybe through subsidies, through welfare, is improving things in the short run, but maybe that's going to lead to some long run challenges. So that's the other narrative. So there's kind of like a positive and a negative, and some people you meet even have both. They have both ideas at the same time. But I would say that's a lot of what you hear about India in the development community in a nutshell.
Raj, I remember in the early 90s as a kid watching telly, in between movies and shows, there would be advertisements of children in India, in abject poverty with mosquitoes running around their head. And that was really the perception of India at that time, right? So now here we are, and India is developing its foreign aid strategy for aid.
And sending a mission to the moon,
It's
very different.
Yeah, and so quite has evolved for India and its rise and its economic status. We're wondering from you, just given your experience at Devex for 25 years, seeing so much around U.S. aid and DFID and all these development institutions, what can India learn now from its counterparts as it develop its own foreign aid strategy? What are their experiences of the US or UK or France?
Yeah, I think there are some hopefully lessons that this kind of newer wave of official donors can learn that would avoid some of the challenges that maybe more traditional global north donors have experienced. And one is, we sort of know there's always going to be a domestic political challenge around foreign assistance, because it's always going to work to tell your public, hey, we have problems at home. Don't send money overseas. Mm-hmm. And so when you know that, that's going to be an issue at some point, then you might want to design your approach to sort of take that into account right from the start. like, you're probably never going to have enough funding to get the full staffing that you might like to see. This is a problem in every foreign aid agency pretty much in the world, because again, there's a sense of like, why are you putting so much money into this when you could put money at home where it's needed?
Yeah.
So you need to design a model that's a little bit light on government workers, on the domestic bureaucracy and infrastructure, but that lets you deliver more funding when you have it. So maybe there'll be like a surge, a moment when you have a lot of funding for a humanitarian reason, or maybe the politics have shifted as they did in the US and Europe in the last 20 years, and suddenly India will have a lot more foreign aid. You need to be able to deliver that without a proportional increase in your headcount in your foreign aid bureaucracy, because that might not be a sustainable political model. So then it leads you to thinking about this other big trend, which is localization. And like, how do you actually more efficiently get money to local organizations in the countries you're trying to support, instead of the very high overhead, bigger international organizations or government programs? And so I think there's an opportunity to learn from some of that, because that's what a lot of donors, USAID is really a leader on this right now, but a lot of others are moving in the same direction, trying to figure out, how do we change our model to deliver more aid locally? And so I guess my idea for all donors, but in particular for newer actors like India, is to think about this idea of pay for performance. Like, to think about not necessarily having a check the box approach to aid, that this meets all of these conditions and criteria, but instead thinking of it a little bit more like a free market and saying, hey, these are the results we want to achieve. There's a neighboring country maybe that we care about for foreign policy reasons. We want to see it develop, and we want to reduce, child mortality there. And so we're ready to pay for that result, but we're not going to mandate how you achieve it. And in fact, we'll open this up through, challenge grants, through third parties, universities, and others to bring in local actors in the most cost-effective way possible, and to fund the things that are working. And so if you've got a great idea, you could be a social enterprise, you could be a company, you could be a university, you can access this funding in a fairly low friction way and actually show what can work. So I know that might sound a little pie in the sky, but I just think there's an opportunity to do that in a way that would reduce some of the overheads, get more money to the people who need it, and drive a kind of virtuous cycle of result.
Yeah, and given that, a country like India is coming to, let's say, coming of age, and it might be premature to say that also in the industry, it might still be in very early stages of its, foreign aid journey. Obviously, the older players in this, the 5 countries that we've spoken about a fair bit, their governments have realized that the private sector is obviously a key player in this, as you were saying, and they're happy to figure out ways to partner and crowd in investment from there. Or that. To what extent should a country like India also be thinking along those lines? Like, you're aware that India has this 2% CSR budget allocation for all profitable companies, I think above a certain size in India. And it's not clear to me how well or how efficiently that 2% piece is even being leveraged or in partnership with government, etc. So talk to us about where you see the role of corporations in a country like India in its aid strategy.
Yeah, I think
how should they plan it? How should the government and the corporation there plan it or design their working in such a way that's most effective, also learning from the experiences of the other countries?
Yeah, I think given the challenges inside India, right, 230 some million people are still undernourished. There's a big role for the private sector in India to be a leader in philanthropy. So, through the CSR law, funding effective philanthropies, and India has many. And ideally, and this is the lesson I think from the rest of the world, integrating these kinds of CSR objectives into the core business model of companies. When you can do that, that's when you can get that virtuous cycle where the business scales, and as it scales, it actually generates, better livelihoods, better results for people in the communities where it works. So I think there's a huge role, given the size of India's private sector, the growth rate of the country, and the need. There's a huge role for companies to play inside the country. And that includes in, sectors like education and health, right? In sectors where the government obviously needs to play the leading role, but, the government can also, regulate those industries, kind of set the rules for the road, but allow for private sector to innovate in those industries in a way that could really have good development results. So I think there's a big opportunity inside the country. I think the other lesson for outside the country, is to be careful what you wish for in a way. Like a lot of countries use foreign aid as a tool for driving their own country's exports and driving their own domestic industry. And you sort of have to really think about what is the goal here? What are we trying to achieve? Because maybe you'll achieve some of that, but at the expense of the other objectives of foreign aid, like long-term development. And a lot of countries are moving more and more in this direction, including European countries, of trying to support their domestic industry through foreign aid. So I wouldn't be surprised if that becomes, a strategy of the Indian government too, because it is fairly common and there's a lot of political support for it. But it's worth just asking, like, what are we really trying to achieve, and prioritizing your objectives, and then allocating your funding against those objectives and those priorities, logically.
Yeah, and any lessons specifically from how you've seen some of the private sector companies like MasterCard and others, right, whose work you might be more familiar with? Any lessons that Indian corporations could learn from their corporate counterparts globally in how best to do this? Obviously, one you said integrated into your business model sustainably. Other than that, any other best practices you see? I heard you mention how the MasterCard Foundation, by allocating those initial shares at the time of IPO, for example, really created that corpus that then grew 15 or 16 times. And that really might be an interesting way for Indian corporations to also think about. But any other kind of best practices that you've seen that could serve the Indian corporations well in their journey?
Yeah, and let me just tell that story quickly, because I think people listening might be interested in this. I talked about this at the Global Inclusive Growth
Yeah, it was
Summit.
fascinating. I found it fascinating when I heard that.
Yeah, and it's a story not many people know. So, MasterCard was like an alliance, or an association of banks. It was owned by the banks in the U.S., and they used it for, developing the credit card industry. But then at a certain point, they said, well, this actually has some legal liabilities. It was getting sued for its high charge rates and things, and maybe it should really be its own independent company. And they ended up doing that and taking it public. And as part of, I think it was 2006, and as part of taking it public, they said, well, we'll set aside some of the shares and put them in a private foundation for philanthropic purposes. And I think it was partly because they wanted that social license to operate, as it's known. That these were banks and a business that maybe wasn't totally popular, and they thought this is a way to kind of show we can do good things too, in addition to the business. It's good for everyone. So they put aside some shares. And at the time, I think they were valued at something like, was it 600 or 700 million? That was sort of the thought of what they were putting away for philanthropic purposes. But they did an interesting thing. And maybe it's because of the location, it was set up in Canada as a private foundation in Canada, but they weren't allowed to sell the shares. Like by charter, they weren't allowed to sell them for 20 years. And so the MasterCard Foundation was set up. They had these shares, and any reasonable fiduciary of any private foundation would have to diversify. If they were allowed to, they certainly would have immediately sold a huge portion of those shares and diversified, and they didn't. And fortunately, they didn't, because a few years later, Ajay Banga became the CEO, and he led the stock price of MasterCard Corporation up 16x in one decade. And so today, MasterCard Foundation is now just starting, like this month or something, to diversify their shares, because they're allowed to. And they're now a $40+ billion foundation, making them the fourth or fifth largest in the world. So it's a fascinating story, right? I don't know that it was intentional, but it landed there. And I guess it does show you a country like India that has so much growth ahead of it. If the growth story that, is being touted can sustain over 10 or 20 or 30 years like China did, if it can really do that, it will create some of the world's biggest corporations, no doubt. That will extend way beyond India. And some of those companies will rival in scale, the Magnificent Seven or what have you, right? Some of them will be at that scale. So yeah, if this is a moment when some relatively small, modest philanthropy could lead to some really big things. So that is one lesson. I think another big lesson is just integrating your business in the kind of the global development ecosystem. So thinking about the UN, thinking about the World Bank, thinking about bilateral aid agencies, development finance corporations as part of the ecosystem that you need to play in as a company if you have global ambitions, right?
Yeah.
That not just seeing that, well, that's philanthropic, that's for our CSR department, but instead saying, well, actually, if we're an Indian company that's trying to roll out technology in sub-Saharan Africa, or maybe a really relevant example is the Serum Institute of India, which is the world's largest provider of
Vaccine
vaccines
makers, yeah.
in Africa and in many low-income countries. I think they produce more than 20% of the world's generic medicines, something like that. So they're huge. For them to play the positive role they want to play in low-income countries and be a massive, successful, profitable company, which they are, they need to play in the global health community. They have to be engaging, and they are. But it's a good example, I think, of you can't just stay in your lane as a company. You need to be a global diplomat in a way and engage and partner with these government and international organizations.
I think that's really excellent advice because just, in the last 5 years, I think a lot of corporations in India, like Walmart and IKEA, even companies like Google and Citi are thinking through how they want to really make use of that 2% mandate, right? Are they seeing it just as sort of a separate line item and a separate team that's being put together, or is it really going to be integrated into their core operations and their core business model? So this is really excellent advice. I mean, thinking big, really looking at the best practices that we're seeing in America and across Europe, and that integration piece of connecting with the larger ecosystem you're seeing, right, of all the development players. That's really good advice. We want to end with any other advice that you think, because the audience is going to be your future aid and philanthropy workers in India, right? So this is a new sector that's really developing, and they
Workers
need
and givers, hopefully,
and
Priyanka.
givers. So, any advice that you can think of for the growing sector or those working in the companies or even government, in the increased strategy of foreign aid as well, of government workers and policymakers that are shaping that is also growing in Delhi as well. So just, any closing thoughts or advice that you would have for the audience would be great.
Yeah, just a couple thoughts. Like one is, the international development, the global development kind of narrative is a little bit awkward because it is countries that are lower income, that don't have as many resources, relying on richer countries, many of which are richer for colonial past or imperial past or what have you, right? And relying on them to come and sort of do good things for these countries. And that creates this real agency problem, right? Like who's in charge? Who has the voice in deciding these things?
Yeah.
And so I think one thing this community has learned, the kind of hard fought, hard learned lessons, are that ultimately the closer you can get to affected communities having a voice, the more likely whatever the thing is you're trying to do is going to work.
Mm.
And I think that's a really important one to take away because, I meet a lot of Indian philanthropists and Indian business leaders, and they now have the resources and the scale, I mean, really at a global level to do enormous things inside India and overseas. And I think to really absorb this idea, this lesson that was hard learned and is still being learned, frankly, but that if you want to solve a problem for someone, start by talking to them, start by asking them, what is your challenge? What is this community's challenge? And what do you need? And how would you solve the problem? And then empower them to do it, as opposed to trying to bring it in all from yourself or from overseas or from outside. I think that's really key.
Is
And I
the
think
design thinking concept, I think, that you've spoken about. And that's
That's
very
right.
that
true
sort
in
of
startups
human-centered
and in
design and
this.
behavioral
Yeah.
science, but bringing that to the table. And I think India, if there's anything that probably the three of us know and your listeners know about India, it is a complex place. It's one country, but it's like a continent in itself. It's the number of languages and cultures and religions. It's a very diverse country. And so to think, well, you're sitting in Mumbai and you're going to design a program in Bihar and you're going to solve, I think you need to really empower local people and I think that's one big lesson. And I think the other one is that global development or development work or just philanthropic and charitable work, however you want to look at it, it's sort of everyone's problem. Like you don't have to work in it as your career necessarily. You might have a more traditional office job somewhere. This is still your space because these issues affect you. They affect your community, your country, maybe your family, and that you have a role in it. Your role might be talking about it. It might be small donations. It might be volunteer work. But don't make the mistake, I think, that was made for a long time of seeing this sector as like an insider's club that you're not part of. Everyone should be part of this. If it's the development of a country or a community, it's everyone's issue. And I hope that's shifting globally, and I think it is. And I think India has a real opportunity as a newer entrant in this space to really shape it in a different way.
That's excellent.
Great.
Thank you, Raj. That's really insightful, and I think a great inspiring note to end on. Thank you for your time today. I'm sure the audience learned a lot about the evolving landscape, new players, and the opportunities that exist for governments and corporations, and lots to think about for India going forward on foreign aid strategy, philanthropy, and the growing income bracket also in India as well, and the CSR mandate. So thank you so much for your time. It was a pleasure to have you here with us.
Thank you.
Thank you
A
so
real
much.
pleasure to be with you, Ani and Priyanka. I really enjoyed it. Thanks for doing this podcast. It's great.